The content presented in Cheshire Corners is for educational and informational purposes only. Please consult a legal professional if you have any questions or concerns about the content of this disclaimer, this series, or the legal implications surrounding psychedelic substances in your jurisdiction. Welcome to Cheshire Corners. I'm Sebastian Coco, and I'll be your host as we trip through the looking glass. Welcome back to Psychospotlight. Thanks for coming back to our series where we interview professional after professional in the psychedelic industry to get a better sense for what's actually going on. Today I'm joined with a very special guest, Dr. Andrew Bard Schmuckler. He is a Harvard graduate who got his PhD at Berkeley, and he is very involved in the theoretical and philosophical world, especially as it pertains to how psychedelics affect society, how society moves and functions, kind of all of these really vacuous, larger, more heady concepts. That's one of these things that Dr. Schmuckler really specializes in. And he's asked me to call him Andy for at least some of the time here. So Andy, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate having you.
I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of adventure this is going to be.
Yeah, me too. For the audience's context, normally we have some sort of, not quite scripting, but just a couple questions, a more rigid back and forth. But Dr. Schmuckler was like, no, let's do this. Let's just talk. Let's see what comes out of it. And honestly, that's the way I prefer to do these kinds of interviews. So let's make it happen. I'm super excited. So let's start. Because I recently graduated college. I think a lot of where we get what we do comes from college or college age, late high school, early 20s, that kind of thing. So talk to me a little bit more about yourself first. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And then how'd you get into Harvard, and how did that kind of work?
Let me just say something about my calling in a way. I was trained from like childhood because of my parenting that I got. My father was a very thoughtful thinker type guy, and from the time of my mid-teens on, it was sort of the die was cast that I was going to spend my life pursuing how to understand the human world, and then. It wasn't in college, it was immediately after college, 1968. The world, my world and the world in general fell apart and led to my having to come up with some answer to the question, why is the history of civilization been as dark and destructive and tormented as it has? And I just got blown off the course of my life asking that question and not knowing how I fit in. And then in 1970, a couple years later, in other words, I had a visionary experience that gave, I think, still an important part of the answer to that question. And that's 1970, and I've been pursuing the paths that has all led to ever since, creating what I'm calling a better human story, which I claim puts the whole issue of our nature, the story of what's happened to our species, and the nature of the challenges that we face in some importantly different light. So that's what I'm about. And the issue of visionary consciousness is a place where there's a bridge between the story I just told about what my life's about and the world of the world of psychedelics is about. So we can maybe meet there.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind, I wouldn't even say the biggest thing, really the first thing that comes to mind in kind of your journey as a visionary. Clearly a lot of this thought started, as you said, in childhood. Your dad was a big thinker, but I'm also kind of based on when you went to Harvard, I'm kind of guessing at the fact that the Harvard psilocybin project had at least some bearing in your life when you went to school there, and maybe even some bearing on how your thoughts formed. So I wanted to get your opinion on that. Did that have any effect on you?
When I went to Harvard, we're talking about 1963 to 1967, the idea of psychedelics had virtually no standing. Some people were aware that Aldous Huxley had written this book, The Doors of Perception, and there was a certain amount of a fringe of people for whom that was kind of titillating. But for the most part, even though something like LSD was beginning to emerge into the world, and the Beatles were sort of carrying some of that forward. Even as that was emerging, the Harvard world itself pretended that it had no room in its thinking for such a thing. That's my impression. Now, I do recognize that it turns out that there were a couple of people there, like Timothy Leary and Alpert, I forget his first name, famous for getting in trouble, I think, and getting fired because of their experiments with psychedelic materials. Timothy Leary eventually became a major figure under some other name that's escaping me now in the movement toward like the idea of an entheogen. I forget what that word exactly is, but the idea that there is access to be had to something important through the ingestion of substances that occur and that have played a shamanic role in anthropological history and all that. It was starting to emerge, but it was way on the fringe.
No, that makes sense, but it's really interesting to hear you say that it was like, it wasn't really something that, we didn't really know about it at Harvard, because in 1961, 1962, like right before you were actually going to Harvard, that's when I can't remember the exact date, but that's when the Harvard psilocybin project actually ended. And it was in the Marsh or Marshall Church experiment. I can't remember the exact name, it's escaping me right now. But it was in that experiment. It's actually one of the few pieces of science from the psilocybin project that's looked back on as like good science. But it was one of the first kind of Western indications that what you're talking about, the entheogenic experience, kind of that the plant medicine almost ethos that native cultures use when kind of, especially in religious and ritualistic settings most often. But it was this first indication, this Marshall Church, I can't remember the exact name, but it was the first indication that no matter what the cultural context, if there was kind of a ritualistic, if there was a historical, if there was a traditional, intentional context put into your psychedelic use, you could get some really keen spiritual experiences from that. Spiritual food, spiritual knowledge, all this kind of,
It sounds like we're going to be doing a certain amount of history here. And in that context, one of the things which maybe is worth noting is how much the consciousness of American culture did not have really much space at all. Any young person now could probably have difficulty imagining quite the nature of the permissible consciousnesses that, as were seen by America as a whole. I mean, there were jazz musicians that smoked marijuana, but in the culture in which I grew up, the idea, nobody that I knew was using marijuana. I think I can bet in a 1,500 student body in suburban St. Paul, Minnesota, I mean, it was not, it was scandalous enough if anybody got a hold of some beers. But there was a strong ethos against anything on the other side of the line that the American legal system had drawn. And I think that persists for a very great while, but it's been a gradual opening, and very gradual, to the possibility that there are altered states of consciousness that have legitimacy and value besides drinking 3 beers or 3 shots of whiskey or something like that. And when I finally found myself on the other side of that line, it was very strongly drawn in the culture as around a generation gap, that there was a generation that thought it was perfectly legitimate to come home to a cocktail because alcohol was one of the spaces, one of the substances that was permissible to use, but the people would be thrown into jail with the key thrown away if they were caught coming home and having a joint. So that was a major cultural divide around which a whole battle got fought. And over the years, the narrowness of that American culture has given way to to a lot of things, not all of them great, but we don't have a very defined space about what's permissible and what's not. But the idea that there will be people who take substances. I mean, an NFL football player publishing in the New York Times about his experience with ayahuasca and how that transformed his life. I mean, there's nothing like that in the New York Times before a certain point.
No, totally. I mean, what you're pointing at is there's a lot of psychedelic scholars that specifically, I'm thinking of Nichols. He's a scholar he's still active, and in the early and mid 2000s, he's done a lot of meta-analyses of psychedelic studies, both scientific, cultural, and all that kind of stuff. And one of the conclusions he kind of drew was that part of the villainizing that led to this 50-year research gap between the establishment of the DEA and really like the last 10-ish years, one of the big reasons for that was this kind of generational friction that happened around what you kind of said when the world ended in 1968, Vietnam. There was just a lot of kind of an old generational thought that these substances are only for partying and da-da-da-da-da. And you see a lot of articles today about, hey boomers, here's how you can use that party mushroom to actually make your life better.
The core thing is not so much the generational thing, but the generational thing has to do with there being a transformation intellectually and to some extent spiritually, for better and for worse, in the overall structure and consciousness of the culture. There was what is the expression? Tightly wound aspect of American culture. There was a whole lot of lines drawn about what can and what must not happen. The rates of illegitimate births among whatever population you might imagine was very small compared to what it became a generation later. A lot of things got loosened up. And one of the things I think that it was worth pointing out is that alcohol and marijuana are two very different spirits, as it were. The spirits we call spirits are basically about releasing the animal spirits or something like that. It's dissolving inhibitions so that people will become, it's a safety valve for the parts of the self that are repressed. and the feelings and passions that get suppressed. Marijuana takes one into a different way of thinking and seeing and understanding. And so, in a particular kind of a political order, I think, the king, just to speak metaphorically in part, is fine with his subjects going off to the bar and getting plastered. There's no threat to his throne that will come from that. It's just people misbehaving. But if you start having people alter their consciousness in other ways, like ways that at least some people find that marijuana assists, you get to see things for yourself. You don't necessarily buy the dogma that's been handed down because you're looking at things in ways that are different from your habitual ways. And that can be subversive. So I think that one of the things that accompanied our transformation from a society that allowed alcohol but doesn't allow marijuana to one that in which now marijuana is also being allowed. That part of that picture is that the powers that be are not in a secure position. We've lost the alignment that formerly kept decent order in America, and part of the freedom is we've got some force of fascism that has arisen in the country that wouldn't have arisen back then.
What would you say about a lot of the studies coming out about the addictiveness of marijuana, kind of some of the dependency rates, some of the ways that it habitually it doesn't mirror alcoholism in severity or any way like that at all, but it has affected lives in debilitating manner in sometimes a similar way. So I don't know if that has any bearing of thought in that kind of realm for you, as well as the fact that as someone who's currently employed in the marijuana industry, and who's, Colorado is really at the heart of what a marijuana industry is, could be, should be, maybe, question mark. It's very corporatized, and this is happening in California, Oregon as well, like an entire new corporate machine, and honestly one that in a lot of instances is much less efficient and can be much more harmful. So I don't know if either of those have kind of bearing in this new world order and how marijuana fits into that.
So I'm not going to get into things having to do with the industry. That's not the level at which I find this most interesting. I mean, I've been, a participant and observer in an ongoing struggle in America, in which the outcome of the wave of legalizations of marijuana is a outgrowth of that phenomenon. And I'd like to stick with the meaning of that. Now, you said, people get into trouble with marijuana. First of all, let me just say, if you compare the difficulties and dangers that marijuana's role in American society may be with those of alcohol, I mean, there's no comparison. But you're right. People deal with powerful things with good judgment or bad judgment. They make good choices or they make bad choices. The same is true in their love lives and sex lives, and then, but that is the nature of, and when it comes to human consciousness, I mean, that is where our lives are lived. The realm of experience and of perception and of feeling and of passion and of what truths we seize hold on, they are the essence of our lives. So this is really where it's at. So in other words, if you're dealing with something which affects your consciousness, you are dealing with a sacred substance and a substance that should be treated accordingly. And people who abuse drugs, well, it is a spiritual task to make good spiritual choices. I was frequently a visitor to a website called Erowid.com. You're probably familiar with it because it was 20 years ago, it was the go-to place for all kinds of discussions about people's using this drug or that drug under this circumstance or that circumstance or this combination or that combination, all kinds of people bearing testimony. And I read a lot of them. And one of the things that struck me is that people were often being very careless with their souls, with their minds, with their bodies. And we have, that's part of the problem of being a culture that hasn't yet learned how to deal with drugs. I mean, wherever alcohol gets introduced for the first time, the culture has a need to develop a way to deal with that. I mean, cultures and drugs are a work in progress wherever you look. Even go back to the coffee houses in Europe in the 17th century. So it's a job, and it's not surprising that a lot of people will have difficulty making all the right choices. And it's such a big challenge, actually, that even the people who make good choices are challenged to make the most of the choices they make. I mean, one thing that I felt back in the 70s was that a lot of people had very meaningful experiences, which they were delighted to have. But then they didn't do the work of integrating those experiences into the rest of their lives. I don't fully understand what that was about, but it seemed like people were shown something important, and instead of creating a sacred text which they would carry with them for the rest of their days, they let it slip into the past. And so I think that, there's all kinds of challenges that you undertake when you start dealing with sacred stuff. And that means anything that affects our consciousness, how do we use it as a tool for the best possible outcome?
Certain elements of what you've been talking about, I have heard similar philosophies regarding protecting your soul, regarding calling alcohol spirits for a reason beyond, tradition, like there is an actual spirit within the alcohol, that kind of, like a lot of the integration stuff, a lot of what you've been talking about, it reflects actually what, a lot of the philosophy I discussed with a master shaman when I went to Arizona for a weekend a little while back. And a lot of other principles of what you're talking about, specifically regarding integration, are really key with modern psychedelic therapies and kind of how those are developing. So do you have any bearing for how some shamanic thoughts and influences might have affected your kind of philosophical guidelines? And really how maybe also your own quote-unquote psychedelic therapy experiences, before that term was even a thing, might have shaped your understanding of kind of this whole realm that you're talking about.
Well, the idea of the shaman is kind of an interesting one for me. I have one sibling. He's a brother. He's a psychotherapist practicing in Berkeley, California, and has been there for, even as he's also, like me, our father's son who has thought through a lot of things. But the thing is, I also see myself as a shaman. In a very different sense, that my brother sits and is present to individuals and gives them things that help them become more whole. My trip has been speaking to my fellow human beings about things that I've seen. And a certain amount of that seeing has been a sort of shamanic openness to some kind of revelation, to use a strong word, of some important truth from a realm that sees into the core of things, and that's another one of the functions of shamans. Shamans have been both healers, and there have been people who often using substances, whether it's this vine in the Amazon or this mushroom in Siberia, using substances to visit some kind of a realm that's not the day-to-day, and coming back to the community with some kind of message that the community can use to help it survive. And I see that as a fundamental part of basically the human experiment. Going way back, is that we humans have developed the ability to access a special realm of experience, and that sometimes substances can be involved in accessing that realm. But also other people have other experiences where there are no substances involved. But there seems to be a commonality about getting to some place which is deeper, more real, somewhat revelatory. So the shaman has his rituals, his ways, whatever they may be, to access the spiritual realm, where truth is to be found that apparently is adaptive for the community to take seriously. And that's part of what I believe, that we have within us a realm from which we can get messages that in our ancestral past helped our ancestors to survive, that those who had that capacity, and I think it's perfectly legitimate to develop disciplines about how to get to that space. And some of them have to do with sitting and meditating and have no drugs, and some of them can involve having drugs. But access to that realm is crucial.
No, that's totally valid. I think that's something that, what you're talking about is at the core of religions, it's at the core of various, spiritual, cultural practices, like really the core of when it gets down to what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be alive, there is something there that really resonates with us, even if we're not sure exactly what it is. And I think a lot of that almost magic has been lost in the modern day, both from like an highly urbanized perspective, a highly capitalized perspective. You're seeing a lot of different factors kind of come in and almost diminish. I think they're a little, I'm not sure if you're aware of them, but the Studio Ghibli movies, in my opinion, are a great example of this. They're Japanese animations that show little pieces of natural magic basically still left in the world. That's like a recurring theme throughout all the movies. And I really think that's super key in the modern day to keeping some semblance of sanity, to not become a total automaton. And I think that's a really key part of what philosophy actually is how do we be human? How do we effectively work in the world? So tell me a little bit more about your own, because I know I think you've written books, correct me if I'm wrong, on secular spiritualism. So if you could talk to me more about your opinion on just your personal kind of belief structure within that thought process, as well as how you think modern society would really benefit from having some sort of, I'm not gonna call it religious intent, I'm not gonna necessarily call it spiritual intent. I think you can even get this from, old objects that have a lot of history. I think history can provide the same almost aura of of awe, of ritualistic use, of all this kind of thing. So I don't know. In the modern day, obviously now everyone has a lot of options, choices. Hell, people can make their own. I mean, I've been making up traditions with my girlfriend as like a new family kind of thing, and that's something that humans keep doing. But are there any overarching trends, any overarching philosophies that you see as really helping us as humanity stick together and kind of weather the storm?
Well, I think that I think you're pointing to something important, which is there are important defects in the consciousness of our civilization right now, and I think most of us can probably find traces of those defects in our own consciousness. I mean, there's such an abundance of stuff. We're sort of overwhelmed, and there's so many distractions, and we don't have. And part of what I was talking about before, there's been an unraveling. That old culture in America that was more tightly wound and coherent had its important defects, but it did hold things together in a way that I think we're just, at this point, there's a lot of breaking into pieces that goes on. Just one area is, it used to be that that every household got their news from ABC, NBC, or CBS. Walter Cronkite, that's the way it is. I mean, everybody got their news, and you could get different slants, but basically, whichever network you were watching, you were getting the same basic picture of what the situation was. And now we've got people who are, we've got the audience so split that we've got people in a whole network who have a picture of what's happening in the world, which is completely divorced from reality. We've broken apart at that level. And, so I think that what's important is that we strive to find a constructive way to put things together, not necessarily in a kind of straitjackety way, but in more wisely chosen ways, and that is what I'm off for. That purpose is what I'm offering my Better Human story, because I think at least some important pieces can be put together. And one of the other defects in the world of today is that the people who are not religious, in other words, the people with a secular worldview, for the most part, and I say this based on a generation of experience interacting with the secular worldview, most of them don't really believe that the moral dimension is important and real. They think it's a matter of opinion or merely subjective. So I think that the whole idea, we've got a secular world out there that's working its way toward incorporating psychedelics into it, but does not have a very good framework like the kind that religions provide for what's meaningful and what's important and what's really true. And I've watched how liberal America, for example, has been incredibly slow to recognize what was rising on the right. There's just blind spots in the secular worldview because there's no such thing as good and evil. I claim to prove that there is such a thing as good and evil, defined as I define them. And I think that if we open our spirits, we will find we have to work our way toward a shared spiritual framework, at least shared enough that we can make effective common cause against the force of brokenness that's assaulting everything that's whole about America right now.
No, yeah, that's fair. That's interesting. That's an interesting point. I was in the shower this morning and I was thinking about specifically good and evil, and I was like, I know it's going to come up today. I'm talking to a philosopher. Of course, we're going to talk about good and evil. And I was very much solidifying how I feel on it, and it's very interesting to me what you just said. there is no good and evil to the secular world. I posit there is good and evil, but it's how I define it. It's within my moral structure. And I think that is the key right there. I think it's really interesting. I think you're exactly right. What you're pointing to is that in the secular world, there is no moral tradition. There is no moral hierarchy. It's hard to have any sort of existential framework beyond what you're able to attach yourself to, which is likely why more highly educated people are able to be secular more successfully, just because they have more philosophy, more information to actually form what their moral code is actually, you know, made up of. Because I as a very
it's not just my moral framework. See, the evolutionary framework is the thing I operate in. We haven't really talked that much in those terms, but that is the fundamental thing. And in that framework, you can see that value emerges in the evolutionary process. There can be no value until you've got creatures for whom experiences range from the better to the worse. If there's nothing that experiences things in terms of this is better and that's worse, then nothing can possibly matter. But we kinds of the creatures like us and other than us did emerge. And it emerged because the value is for creatures who feel things in their experiential realm to have better experiences rather than worse. That's sort of the bedrock. And that's what evolution has crafted into us, because that better and worseness that we experience corresponds to what helped the motivation to help our ancestors survive. So it's life-serving. And so to the secular worldview that I've encountered repeatedly I remember doing a radio show on Wisconsin Public Radio where the only thing you could talk about making a judgment is that the only judgmentalism is bad. No, there is something built into us. Not my moral framework, but the human moral framework, which builds out of what's good is for creatures to thrive and to have experience that is fulfilling, because there really is a difference between fulfillment and misery.
No, totally. I completely agree. I think what I like to call one of the things you're pointing at is like empathetic existentialism. This thought that, you know, and it's almost, I point back to the evidence of it in the very basic moral codes of the first religions around the world. Most all of them say, do not kill, straight up. Like that's one of the 10 commandments, it's just very, around the world, one of the very base moral codes is don't kill other people, because people don't want to be killed. There's a very base empathetic existential, like, I do not want to experience this, so therefore it must be evil, and let's mark it up as that. Like, and then there's been this almost bastardization in the modern age of, because we have this almost moral decadence where we've been taking these codes and adapting them from survival, and we don't really need to fight to survive anymore, truthfully. I think we find ourselves in this morally decadent place where we assign evil to something just existential and not affecting our actual survivability, in part because there is a perception of defense.
Well, I claim that I can show something, a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world more whole. In other words, when I'm talking about good versus evil, I'm really talking as an analyst, a social scientific analyst, who looks at the web of cause and effect and sees that the causes and the effects show an interconnection where you can see a pattern of brokenness being moved through the human world, so that I say that I can show a force that you can see in the same sense that we can see the wind in the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. And I can show it through cause and effect that war, say, produces effects, and that war is a form of brokenness, and the effects of it are predominantly matters of brokenness at various levels. And it's the brokenness is a pattern which changes from sometimes at the level of intersocietal warfare, and sometimes at the level of the trauma of human beings, and it goes back and forth, and you can see the figure emerging through time of a coherent force that works to make the human world worse. And I say, that's pretty much what traditionally has been understood as what evil looks like. The force of evil in the religious traditions often had that characteristic, that it was a coherent force, and that all of its interactions with the human world made things worse. So I say, you don't have to call it evil, but it looks like evil, and I think we should relate to it as evil because it's very ugly.
So, Dr. Schmuckler, Andy, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate having you. It's been awesome just sitting, talking philosophy. I think a lot of your points on how society is currently formed and kind of the trends that have gotten us here, and just looking at good and evil as sociological forces, really, rather than simply moral or traditional ones, I think is a really very interesting and I think useful point. So could you tell us, do you have any more, closing notes, little wrap-up thoughts? But before that, can you tell me and really the viewers where to find more of your writing, your research, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think that the better we can see the battlefield, the more likely we are to fight successfully. And we are, as a species, in a fight right now. I think it's a toss-up whether human civilization will, in the not so many generations to come, will either get its act together well enough to survive for the long haul, or if we don't do that well enough or soon enough, we'll destroy ourselves. And so I think that we are called upon to rally ourselves to fight this fight. And that involves, both recognizing that we're up against destructive forces, and to recognize what they are and what they look like and how they might best be fought. But in addition to that, to be inspired by some sense of the sacred thing that we are called upon to fight for. What could be more important than whether human beings destroy life on Earth with a nuclear holocaust or not? What could possibly be from the Star Wars, a disturbance in the Force. Well, for all we know, this is where life has expressed itself so far, and has taken a chance with a species that creates civilization. And that's the other thing, that book over my shoulder, The Parable of the Tribes, is that first experience in 1970. But as people may have heard, besides explaining why civilization developed in such a destructive way, I've been working to develop other dimensions, which I've alluded to in the course of all this. And if people think that maybe something important is being laid out here that helps to make sense of our situation, I hope that they'll go to my website, which is abetterhumanstory.org, where I have done my best to show what it is I think I've seen. And some of that perception has been assisted by my strivings to make good use of things that open up the realm of important spiritual truths. And then I apply my academically trained mind to laying it out so my fellow human beings can see the same thing. And it takes a certain amount of chutzpah to say, I'm going to deliver the goods if you check it out. But I deeply do believe that some important goods get delivered here, and I hope if it would matter to you, you'll check it out at abetterhumanstory.org.
No, I completely agree. Definitely check out abetterhumanstory.org if this is the kind of thing you're into. Also, if this is the kind of thing you're into, Dr. Schmuckler does streams regularly on his YouTube channel, which we will link in the description below. So if you want to hear him talk more about philosophy, about society, the human story, the human experience, any of that kind of stuff, all of that is addressed on Dr. Schmuckler's channel. I want to say personally, Andy, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciated having you here. Your conversation with me was very interesting. It was good to have. It reminded me of a lot of the conversations I had in college, honestly, of like figuring out philosophy, morality, of kind of where we stand in the world, that kind of thing. So I feel like I gained a lot in our conversations about society. And I feel like if, for the viewer, if this is something that you guys are interested in, you can learn a lot from this kind, engaging in philosophy, engaging in existential thought in this scale and this level. So yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Schmuckler. I really, really appreciate it.
I appreciate, Sebastian, that you're a person who continues to be interested in the things that you talked about in college. I mean, it seems like it's widely true that people in the college age, 18 to 22 or whatever, asks important questions and work to reach understandings. But it's often the case that then people, maybe they feel like they got as far as they're going to get, or don't see how you're going to get any further. I don't know, but I do notice a life pattern that often people were inquiring for the meaning of things at a young age, and then they just develop a life and they live that life without it continuing to be a quest for a fuller understanding. I place a real high value on understanding. I'm kind of obsessed with it as a value, but I appreciate that you're someone who the very existence of this podcast suggests that you're still interested in asking some of those questions, and I appreciate that.
No, absolutely. In my opinion, most of the world has been explored over. Deep space is almost entirely empty. That's not really worth exploring quite yet, in my opinion. I don't like getting wet, so the ocean is that's not for me. So the human consciousness and neuroscience and the brain, those are really the last realms of exploration. And to me, in so many ways, like Albert Hoffman's invention of LSD is the same in scale as the Portuguese invention of a ship that can cross an ocean. You know what I mean? Those are of same scale, just in different points in time. So I'm really, really lucky to be a part of this kind of the field of psychonauts, of explorers, of that kind of thing. Just because there's only so many windows in civilization where you can still do this, in my opinion. So I'm only lucky to be asking these kinds of questions. And to our viewers at home, I highly recommend getting on that exploratory train because it's different for everyone, and it's a really amazing experience. So yeah, that's my personal plug for asking questions. Please, no, yeah.
if I may, I want to say that that the stuff, whatever, is a means to an end, and it is the end that is really where it's at. That like in the books teaching of Don Juan, these are teachers. What can be learned of important truth, moral truth, or spiritual truth, or just factual truth that enriches and fortifies what's of value in our consciousness. That's the focus should be on learning how to use them as instruments to the ends that are really important, which is where we have understanding or don't have understanding, where we are spiritually alive or spiritually dead, where we are aligned with good or we are aligned with evil. That's where it's at.
No, I completely agree. I absolutely completely agree. Again, Dr. Schmuckler, thank you so much for being on the show. Guys, check out abetterstory.org. I believe I got that right. And Dr. Schmuckler's YouTube channel as well as we'll have all of his other stuff linked in the description. So if you're interested in Dr. Andrew Bard Schmuckler, definitely check out the description. We've got plenty for you there. And of course, guys, if you enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. It really, really, really helps the channel out. And it lets me, stay behind this camera and actually keep bringing this kind of stuff to you guys, keep asking these questions. So until next time, Dr. Schmuckler, thank you so much for joining us. And everyone at home, don't get psyched out.